Good morning everyone and welcome to the latest transfer special of On The Whistle. I'm back from a little break, thoroughly enjoyed catching up with Sunderland's win at the weekend and ready for some deadline day carnage, and we're here this morning to chat a little bit about what looks like two potentially very significant Sunderland additions to get deadline day up and running. Now, usual disclaimer, it's just after 9 a.m. When I'm recording this, so we're going to talk about Lutsharel Geertruida. Apologies for the pronunciation, I'll get to the bottom of that if and when he signs, and Brobbey, who both look as if they could be joining Sunderland today. Now, it's just after 9 a.m. Neither of these deals have been confirmed, so I don't know when you watch this. They might already be Sunderland players, they might not be happening, a la Armand Loriente, but it looks at this point, as we've done all summer, we've recorded these videos looking at these players and what they can bring to Sunderland when it looks pretty likely that they're going to join, and that's certainly the state of play at the moment. So Geertruida, currently at RB Leipzig. Sunderland have agreed an initial loan deal for this season, but with an option to buy of around 20 million euros next summer. And Brobbey, that looks like it's going to be a permanent deal, 20 million euros up front in the region of, with a potential for around 5 million euros in add-ons on top of that. Now, this is obviously a really interesting one because this is of course linked to Chelsea's decision or request to recall Mark Guiu from his loan. He's only played 3 games for Sunderland, but after Liam Delap got an injury, which looks like it's going to keep him out for around 2 months, Chelsea started talks with Sunderland about bringing Guiu back. Now, there was no recall clause, so Sunderland didn't have to agree to it, but Sunderland do have an excellent relationship with Chelsea. Of course, they wouldn't want to have left themselves light up front, and it looks like the opportunity to sign Brobbey, it appears that that's given them the comfort, if you like, to potentially allow Guiu to go back to Chelsea, but I can't stress enough that at time of recording, neither of these deals has happened. So that's a little bit of a deadline day chain. We'll wait and see how that happens, but I would strongly assume that if Sunderland are able to sign Brobbey from Ajax, that they would then be happy to let Guiu go back to Chelsea, because they would then have 3 strikers in place, and Brobbey is a player who's got a lot of top-level experience and someone who's going to clearly be competing for minutes from day one. But first, we're going to have a look at Lutsharel Geertruida. Again, apologies for my pronunciation. So what kind of player is he? What's he going to bring to the squad? What does this mean from Sunderland's defensive options? So the first thing to say is, in terms of positionally, not so much as a style of play, but in terms of positionally, there are strong similarities here with Nordi Mukiele. And of course, not just because they both played in Germany last season. Mukiele, of course, at Leverkusen, Geertruida at Leipzig. So Geertruida came through at Feyenoord, and that's where he spent the bulk of his career, a regular for a long period of time in the Eredivisie, moved to Leipzig last summer and played regularly last season actually. Now, he's similar to Mukiele in that primarily he's probably a right back, however he has played an awful lot of football at centre back. So he'd be very, very comfortable in both positions in Sunderland's current 4-3-3 system. And he would also be very comfortable playing on the right of a back 3 if at any point Sunderland do move to that system. So right back, centre back would definitely be his 2 main positions. However, like Mukiele, versatility is a real strength of his. He has also played at left back at times for Leipzig, and previously in his career he has also played in defensive midfield. So there's a lot of versatility there. What are we looking at statistically? What are his key strengths? Where does he kind of stand out? Well, the first thing to say that he is very strong defensively. If we look at Y-Scout's data for the Bundesliga last year, he was 14th for recoveries in terms of defenders and 12th for counter-pressing recoveries. So that's a really, really strong sort of defensive skill set, if you like. He also ranked really highly for tackles. So if I look at FBref, which is the stats website, which we've been using a lot this summer to look at all these exciting new signings that Sunderland have made, he was in the top 14% for tackles in the defensive third of the pitch, and he was also in the top 22% of tackles won per 90. Significantly, a bit like Mukiele, he was also in the top 1% for the percentage of aerial duels that he won in the Bundesliga last season. Lebris has made really clear that in the latter stages of the window, he wanted to add some height and some aerial prowess because he felt it was a position where Sunderland were potentially vulnerable. Set pieces, of course, so important in the Premier League. He felt that he was really happy with Sunderland's options, but he was a little bit worried about a lack of height, a lack of aerial prowess. Mukiele was a big part of addressing that. And Geertruida very much adds to that, some really impressive heading numbers. But if I was to kind of pick out the bit that really impresses me about Geertruida, the bit that statistically really stands out, is that he's excellent in possession. He's a really, really strong passer of the ball and really good in build-up play. So if we look at his FBref stats for passing last season, now this is comparing him to fullbacks. His stats would be even more impressive if we were to compare him to centre-backs. But he was in the top 1% of the top 5 divisions for long passes completed, the top 4% for progressive passing distance, and also the top 2% for touches in the middle third of the pitch. So that tells you that he's getting really involved in advanced areas and really involved in the build-up play. So very comfortable in possession. Y-Scout also, another stat there, he was 10th for defenders in terms of passes completed per 90 in the Bundesliga last season. So this is a player really comfortable on the ball. And I think this is really relevant because when I was researching John Lusumi a little bit earlier this summer, when it looked like Sunderland were going to try and sign him and he might be coming to the club, what really stood out about Lusumi was his defensive numbers were really good, but his passing numbers were off the scale, really top-level European elite passer of the ball. That was clearly something that Sunderland wanted to add to their defensive options, a bit more sort of quality in build-up play, a bit more composure in possession. And I think that Geertruida signing to me looks maybe a little bit like they're trying to address that. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the Lusumi deal is off. Again, I'm recording earlier this morning. This could have changed a little bit or potentially significantly by the time you watch this. But I think it's clear that Bologna's stance at this stage hasn't changed. They're asking for, if they were to sell Lusumi, it would be an absolutely massive bid because they're certainly digging their heels in and not accepting the level that Sunderland have offered so far. They also haven't made a huge amount of progress in adding more defensive options of their own, which has kind of strengthened their stance on Lusumi. So while Sunderland really like Lusumi and therefore you can't rule it out, I think the fact that they're moving on Geertruida tells you that the Lusumi deal at this point is quite unlikely. And I'm definitely seeing some things in Geertruida that suggest to me like he might be a good alternative to Lusumi. Not exactly the same for sure, but in terms of some of their skill sets and some of the qualities that they bring to the squad and in terms of adding something different to Sunderland's defensive options, I think there's definitely some similarities. And yeah, the fact that Geertruida can compete in a number of different positions across the back line, I think makes him a really, really sort of savvy late addition. Watching his clips, he definitely has some strengths in the final third. I've seen him make some good overlapping runs, seen him score a few goals, both with his head and his feet, put some really nice crosses into the box. But I think, yeah, he has some really strong defensive attributes and also very, very calm in possession. Those are the kind of the main things that stand out from the research I've done of him. So Brian Brobbey, a really interesting player this. So currently at Ajax, he did have a spell at RB Leipzig, but moved back to the Eredivisie. Some really interesting statistics. I've been watching a lot of his clips since the news broke last night, trying to understand a little bit more about him. So only 4 goals in the Eredivisie last season, but I can't stress enough that that's a really interesting quirk in terms of doesn't really reflect his goal scoring prowess across his career. So in the previous 2 Eredivisie seasons before last one, he scored 18 and 13 respectively. So he really can be a goal scorer. According to Y-Scout as well, his expected goals for the last calendar year was actually 14.61, and he only scored 8 goals in that time. So that suggests he's been on a little bit of a poor streak in terms of his finishing, but it tells you that he does get into good goal scoring positions. And generally speaking, the story of his career would suggest that in time, those goal scoring numbers are going to improve again, because generally speaking, he's a pretty decent finisher and he's still getting into good positions. What I think is clear about Brobbey from his analysing his stats and also watching his clips is that he will offer something a little bit different to Wilson Easter and Elijah Mienda, and that he's much more of a creator and he's much more heavily involved in build-up play. Now, Mienda's stats are actually outstanding in terms of the chances that he creates for his teammates, the number of passes he plays in the final third, the number of sort of chances he creates. But that's normally through his dribbling. So if we think about Mienda at his best, it's taking players on, it's driving into space and bringing his teammates into the game that way. Isidore, really a lot more of a finisher, especially when he plays in the final third, not hugely involved in build-up play. More so in the little flashes we've seen him on the left wing, but certainly up front, more of a finisher, more of a guy who wants to run in behind and chase passes. Brobbey, watching his clips, is really strong, really comfortable getting his back into the defender, really comfortable receiving passes fired into his feet, playing little first-time layoffs, bringing others into the game, creating shots for them around the box. I think he's a really strong creator, and that's something that definitely is different to what Sunderland have and really comes through from watching his clips. So just to underline that, his stats last season, when, as I say, it was not necessarily the best season of his career generally, still really strong in certain aspects. So he was in the top 15% of assists per 90. So this was across what FBref would term as the next 14 divisions, so outside of Europe's 5 biggest leagues, if you like, but really strong numbers. Top 2% for progressive passes received, top 12% for combined expected goals and expected assists per 90 minutes, and also in the top 18% for key passes per 90. So again, if you like, his construction statistics are really impressive. And as I say, last year wasn't really his strongest season. If you go back to the previous 2 Eredivisie seasons, his goal scoring and his shooting stats were really good, but his passing numbers and his creation numbers were even stronger than they were last season, when they were actually very good. So clear to me that Brobbey is someone who's going to bring something a little bit different, maybe a little bit more comfortable with back to goal than some of his current options. Probably a little bit similar to Mark Guiu in that sense, in terms of kind of some of the skill sets of a traditional number 9, although I think Brobbey, from what it looks like, is a bit more likes to play with his feet rather than Guiu, who we talked about as a really kind of traditional target man number 9, if you like. So it's going to be really interesting to see how he goes. As I say, not coming off his best season, but someone who's got a really strong record over a period of time at kind of top level European football. So it's going to be really interesting to see how he goes if that deal does go through. As I say, please bear in mind when you're watching all these videos, there may be 1 or 2 more a day we'll see. But this is a really fast changing environment. But as it stands, looks like Geertruida and Brobbey might be coming in, which would suggest that Mark Guiu will return to Chelsea, and probably that John Lasumi won't sign from Bologna. But let's see how the day develops. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight into these 2 potential new signings. Really nice to be back doing some on the whistle videos. As I say, let's see how the day develops. Could we be back with another one? Let's wait and see. I'll certainly be back with a sort of wrap up of my thoughts on the window and where Sunderland have landed later on. So just keep your eyes peeled for that, I guess. But as ever, thanks so much for watching.